This is for pantsers out there, and if you don't know what a pantser is in writing, it's someone who doesn't outline their book. If you're a pantser, I'm going to try to convince you that you should actually outline your book and why it can be really helpful to you. Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppy. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. If it is your first time here, How to Write Good is a writing podcast that seeks to find principles and advice that can be applied across a broad range of writing situations. If you've been here before, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button below, and share. To speak with complete transparency, I am a person who pretty much outlines every single story I write these days. There have been times in the past when I haven't, and I found that a certain something happens when I don't outline books. I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do. It takes me a lot longer to get to the end of a first draft than if I outline the book. If you've been writing for quite some time, you may say that you have no issues with writing without an outline. And that might just be the case that you've gotten so much practice that you know how a book moves so that you don't need one anymore. But I think you are the exception. I think that most people would benefit from having an outline. Now, when I talk about an outline, I don't mean going into depth about every little tiny thing. I mean a basic structure that you can follow to write your book. It doesn't have to be hundreds of pages long. It could be just one. Though I will not go so far as to say some of you may benefit from having an outline that digs deep into every single scene. So why? Why do I think that having an outline will be beneficial to you? The first reason is because it helps you know where you're going. If you start a book and you don't know what the end is going to be, you're going to have a hard time developing that book. By having the end goal in mind and having how that process looks to get you toward the end goal, it'll help you push the characters and the story in the direction of what is happening at the end. This is especially important with characters. I believe the core of a story is characters. I've talked about it in the past. You can check out my episodes where I've talked about it. The core of the story is the main character, and the core of the story in relation to the main character is the character change that happens in that character. If you develop an outline and it's extremely basic, and one of the only things you include is who the character is at the beginning and who the character is at the end, you'll know which direction to push for the character change. And you can do this with any type of story because every type of story has this similarity. Every type of story has a character who starts in one state and moves toward another state, and even if by the end of the story the character does not shift into that second state, this process of moving toward it creates a question in the reader's mind and creates tension. Now, some of you pantsers may be thinking at this time, well, I can just figure out who the character is at the beginning and figure out who they are at the end, and I can fill in the blank spaces. But this applies to every single chapter. The character starts in one state at the beginning of a chapter, and they have a specific goal, and they're running into specific issues during that chapter. And you need to know where they're going to be at the end of each chapter so that you can make the logical push as you write toward that end goal or toward that character's end state. The second reason why I think you should outline is because it allows you to connect details together better. If I go through the outlining process, it doesn't take me the mental effort to come up with story ideas as I write, and I can shift that mental effort toward the writing process. Now, during that writing process, I might think of something that happens later in the story, and I might think to myself, I can actually put a reference to what happens later in the story at this point. I can add little details that connect to the thing that happens later. But if you are coming up with your story as you write, you just don't have as much brain capacity to put in these little details or think about those other little things as you are writing. The third reason I think you should outline is because it helps you develop the different sections of your story better. When you're actually doing the basic outlining of your story, you actually put more effort toward what happens in your story because you're focusing just on the story, you're not focusing on the writing. This is similar to what I was just talking about before about connecting details in your story together. If you're writing and coming up with your story, it's taking up more brain capacity, so you're not going to be able to write as well or connect things together as well. If you are developing your story at the same time as writing, you're not going to be able to come up with as many ideas because your brain has only so much capacity. So by taking time to outline specific things in your story, you are taking time to specifically focus on those story ideas. What outlining also does is allows you to think about those specific sections of your story. Specifically, it allows you to daydream about those specific sections of your story. If you take time during the outlining process to allow your mind to drift into each of these different sections, you will be more prepared to write. The reason why I believe you will be more prepared to write is because you will go through the process of experiencing those things before you actually put pen to paper or fingers to the keyboard. If you want to understand this point in a different way, it is kind of like practicing your story before you even start writing your story. And the more you practice it, the more ideas you'll come up with for that section of your story, and I believe the more life you'll pull into that story. Finally, I think that outlining your story actually helps eliminate writer's block. The reason why it does this is because you always know what's coming next. You always know the next section, and if you run into a day where you are not in the mood for writing, where you hate writing, what you do is you sit down and you start writing just the basics of that story. You don't need to add anything extra. You don't need to be creative. And just by the process of writing, you'll overcome that hump of writer's block and you'll be able to be more creative, because we all know that if you have that feeling of writer's block and you just start writing and you force yourself to write, then you'll overcome it in the end. It just takes time. But if you don't have the outline, you don't know how to start that process. If you do have the outline, you just have to start writing what you have in the outline. For the first draft, it doesn't need to be good. It doesn't need to be great. It doesn't need to be inspired. But it does need to be done. And by having that outline, you have no excuse because you already know what you're going to write. So just write it, and then you can always fix it later. Now, my one final note on outlines is that I don't believe you should strictly stick to your outline when you write. I think in some cases you can follow your outline exactly, but in the end, your book is the final polished thing you've written. It is not the outline. So if something in the outline does not work in the book, if when you write something from the outline it comes across wooden, if it seems like you're just following an outline, you can deviate from it. For myself, I've developed a process that is somewhat pantsing and somewhat outlining. I outline in depth quite a bit. I outline every chapter, I outline every scene, I outline every little section of every little scene. And when I am writing, I have my outline right next to me, but I am not constantly referring to it. I get the basic sense of what I'm doing, and then I write. And if I run into a spot where my writing naturally ends, I look back to the outline, I find the next logical step in the story, and I continue there. There are often cases when I am writing and I get into a flow and I write a specific thing, and when I look back at the outline, I realize that the next section of the outline does not fit with what I've written. Well, what I do next is I see which next section fits, and if there is no section that fits, I write the next section, because even though that next section doesn't fit perfectly, I did come up with those ideas for a reason, and maybe the same thing will happen with this next section, or maybe I will find a creative way to connect them together. So if I write an outline, or I tell people to use an outline, I do not mean that they need to strictly stick to the outline when they are writing. The first draft is a creative process, and if you are having fun with something that isn't in your outline, have fun with that thing, see where it goes, and if you need to change details in your story, that is all right. But I think that having an outline and approaching it in this way is something that will benefit almost every single writer. If you enjoyed this, you're probably wondering how you can support me. Well, you can actually do two simple things. Follow the first link below to grab a copy of my book, and then follow the second link and sign up for my newsletter. It's that simple. Those two things will mean the world to me and give me more time to write books and create content for you. As always, my name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good.